the launch event for the APARZEN Centre of Excellence. So it's the culmination of 4 years' work of the APARZEN project, the APARZEN Network of Excellence, combined into one event. I'm Simon Lambert, the Administrative Coordinator of APARZEN. I think all the other APARZEN partners are represented here, plus other people from outside the project. I'm going to be chairing the sessions today. The first session in the morning, we have 4 talks leading, and then the coffee break scheduled for 11:15. First of all, I'd like to welcome Juan Bicaregui, who's the head of the data division within Scientific Computing Department in my own organisation, STFC, and is also chair of the Alliance for Permanent Access. And he's going to say a few words.
Yeah, I can see. Yeah, I've got it. It's all right. Just hopefully when I click that. Okay, so good morning, everybody. As Simon said, I'm Juan Bicaregui, chair of the APA Executive Board. And I'm going to really what I'm going to cover today really is a little bit of history of the APA, how it was founded, what we've done since then, other changes that have happened in the 10 years since the APA was founded, and then talk a little bit about where we are today, what we're doing at this conference, and what the Virtual Centre of Excellence that the APARZEN project has developed is. So, to begin with, where did we start? Well, it's interesting that it's exactly 10 years ago that my awareness of this issue came, and I think this probably was a conference that started a lot of the initiatives. Certainly it was the conference that caused the APA to be formed. John Wood, who will be speaking later this morning, was there and was one of the people behind this. The conclusion of that conference was to establish a European task force on permanent access, and that task force was what eventually became the APA. So the issue was raised as very important, and the task force was set up early in 2005, that it now become called the Alliance for Permanent Access to the Digital Records, and its aims were these. The first one, to establish a wide consensus on a strategic level among the major European stakeholders, etc., about the long-term preservation of and access to digital data for the records of science. So although the words today have changed a little bit, we talk about research data rather than the records of science, a lot of the rest of it is still very, very pertinent today. Second objective for the Alliance at that time, to accelerate significantly the creation of the main building blocks of this infrastructure. Now I wonder, in a couple of slides' time, you'll see why I'm drawing out the 2 points, the wide consensus and the main building blocks being the important things to think about as being the mission for the APA as it was 10 years ago. It actually took a little while to formally incorporate the APA. It was a discussion forum, an informal discussion forum for a while, but in 2008 it was incorporated as a Dutch foundation, the European Alliance for Permanent Access, and its objectives were, firstly, to support the development of a sustainable digital information infrastructure, guarantees permanent access, and the word access to the digital records, whether documents or data, across research, scholarship, culture and technology. And the second objective, to be a platform that will assist key stakeholders to cooperate amongst themselves and with others in digital repositories. So the same 2 themes that were set out in the conference were incorporated into the formal aims of the foundation, the APA. Then we move on another couple of years to the start of the APARZEN project, now called the Alliance for Permanent Access to Records Science Network, and the 2 first tasks in the first work package of the APARZEN project, the creation of a virtual centre of excellence And I think that virtual centre of excellence really is the vehicle by which we deliver the things that have been said in the previous two aims, the main building blocks as was laid down in the aims in 2005, and the sustainable information infrastructure that was put down in 2008 in the APA. And the second task in APASN is the common vision for digital preservation, and that again is really the embodiment of the second aim from the other two principles, establishing the wide consensus, that is the common vision, and a forum for cooperation amongst themselves. So really the APASN project in those two tasks encapsulated the aims that were set out in 2005 and then again in 2008 for the Alliance. So that was just what was happening within APA, if you like. Meanwhile, in parallel with this, an awful lot was happening, and perhaps a lot of it triggered by the APA, but I can't claim to have been behind, the APA was behind everything that happened. The prominence of data management as an issue has risen beyond all understanding compared with where we were. There have been very, very many policy statements, guidelines, principles. Every organisation seems to be making them over the last 10 years. Here I list just a few. The first one I was involved in was the OECD Principles and Guidelines for Access to Research Data from Public Funding. The discussion started in 2004 and it went through various levels of recommendation through to 2006. The Commission themselves made a recommendation on access and preservation of scientific information in a number of declarations over the period there. The G8+5 group on global research infrastructures made a statement of 5 principles of data preservation and access. I put the UK there because I'm from the UK. The UK Research Council put some joint principles of data out in 2011. All these things, a lot of funding bodies were putting out statements of policy or principle about access to data. 2012, a very important document from the Royal Society, Science as an Open Enterprise, which really captured, I think, an awful lot of the motivation for why we believe that transparency and openness in science is very, very important. And that, in a way, set a new sort of milestone in the progress towards that. And in 2013, G8 Ministerial Declaration, they had a meeting at the Royal Society, as it happened, on open research data, and that also talks about the very, very same issues that we've been discussing in the APA and in APASN and in various other fora. Looking at these various policy statements over that decade, it's interesting that things have changed a bit. They've moved from policy to practice. If you look at the OEC declaration, what it is principles and guidelines. You can see how those are fairly abstract things without any real thing to say about how to implement them. By the time you get to the G8 declaration, the wording is very different. It says, we decide to build on existing work to coordinate, et cetera, so they recognize the large amount of work that has gone on in the interim and decide to build on that. Another thing that's been happening in the meantime is around practice, and some of you will know that I'm very involved in the Research Data Alliance, and John Wood will be speaking. John is chair of the Council of Research Data Alliance. He'll be speaking later this morning. But the Research Data Alliance in just 18 months has really done an awful lot. It was first meeting, we're at plenary 4 now. We have the plenaries every 6 months, and at plenary 4, interestingly, was in Amsterdam, not The Hague. The conference that I referred to at the beginning was in The Hague, the plenary 4 in Amsterdam. The Netherlands really have a very prominent position in this whole field. So the plenary 4 in Amsterdam, 18 months after the creation, we had 2,300 members from 93 countries, 30 organizations that are members of the RDA. The work is being done by these people in 17 working groups and 35 interest groups, and 535 people attended the meeting in Amsterdam. I won't go into what the RDA is actually doing in detail. John will be speaking later, and I don't want to cover the same ground that he's going to cover. But I think in that time, a short time of just 18 months, the Research Data Alliance has really become very prominent. the motto, and I'm sure John will use this phrase, he does every time, it's getting things done, right? This is about practical development of infrastructure and standards and protocols and whatever else is needed in order to make data exchange and data preservation a reality. So that's where we are today, and at this conference, it's the final conference of the Aparzen project and the launch of the Centre of Excellence. What can we say? Well, the Virtual Centre of Excellence is a main part of what we're talking about today, and you'll see a programme of talks by the APA members and Aparzen members and others, presenting a collection of services and infrastructure components that are maybe a distributed centre of excellence, we could call it, each organisation offering its own services in a coordinated manner. And the common vision for an information infrastructure developed during the Aparzen project has percolated out. There's several groups in RDA with a lot of the same people that are in Aparzen and APA discussing the various more focused topics in the forum like RDA, which has the advantage, of course, that it's a global forum rather than just a European one. So Europe has a very strong presence in RDA. Just about 50% of the members are European. The second 33% are from the US, and the other 6 are from the rest of the world. So Europe has a very strong presence in RDA, and it's a very useful forum for continuing the discussions that have been started here. And so with that, I claim that the original program set out in 2004 in The Hague is pretty much completed. We've done the things that we set out to do, to provide the forum, to raise the profile of preservation and access, to develop the building blocks of the infrastructure we'll hear about today. And with that, a brave new world begins in 2015 after the Aparzen project. So that's my introduction. Thank you very much. Questions, if you like.
Okay, so now that Juan has given us the panorama of developments over the last 10 years and for the future, I'd now like to invite Manuela Speiser of the European Commission, DG Connect, and particularly our Aparzen project officer, who's been with us on the journey for the last 2 or 3 years, to come and say some words about EU-funded digital preservation research. Thank you.
Set this up for you. Oops.
Yes, good morning. And first of all, thank you for the invitation. For a project officer, it's always a nice experience if a project ends with a result that survives the funding period. So it's a great pleasure for me that I can share this highlight in Aparzen with you. Now, I am a research program officer at the European Commission, and since around 5 years have been responsible for digital preservation research. And from that perspective, I would like to give you an overview and put Aparzen into a context, so to say. I will not start with a long problem statement. Everybody in this room perfectly knows what the benefits of digital preservation are, what the problems are that need to be solved, which challenges need to be addressed. So here, just in a few words, our starting point, so to say. Organizations with a mandate or business interests in the long-term preservation of digital resources basically need 3 things. Technologies that are efficient, affordable, customizable. They need staff that have the right skills and up-to-date knowledge. And they need a legal framework that is not an obstacle to digital preservation actions. Now, the European Commission, generally speaking, has three ways of intervention. One is that we coordinate policies and initiatives in the member states. And in that context, we have produced a recommendation, which we will see in a minute. We can provide financial support, and there we have funded research projects. And in some areas, we also have a legislative mandate. And as you know, there is currently a revision of the copyright law ongoing that will also be continued in the new Commission. I mentioned the recommendation. It's from October 2011, and its full title is Recommendation on Digitization and Online Accessibility of Cultural Material and Digital Preservation. And actually, it's not one recommendation, it's a list of recommendations, three of which address directly digital preservation. Those are that the member states or the institutions in the member states should reinforce their strategies and update the action plans that are in place to implement those strategies. And they should exchange information and good practices. The other one is that the legal frameworks in the member states should be adapted in a way to facilitate preservation actions, typically copying. And the third one is to improve the legal deposit arrangements and to adapt them to digital content. Now, we regularly monitor the progress in the member states towards the implementation of this recommendation, and the last report has been published just a couple of weeks ago. So if you are curious, you can look it up. Closer to my area of work is the research funding. And here we have used the funds available in the ICT program. Initially at the end of the 6th framework program, but mostly under FP7, where the last calls were published in 2013. Throughout FP7, there have been all in all 6 calls, which address specifically digital preservation research, or at least made it possible to submit such proposals. They came under different headings. First, digital libraries, then access to and preservation of cultural and scientific resources. And there also have been calls under the infrastructures program that have attracted digital preservation research proposals. This has resulted, all in all, in 23 projects that have received a total funding of just above 100 million euro. Actually, I should say co-funding, because that does not include the financial contribution from the partners. So you see it's really a massive investment. The projects have brought together some 250 organizations, depending on how you count them, because some participate in more than one project. And those organizations represent all stakeholders concerned. Most importantly, of course, the memory institutions, then also the academic researchers, the technology providers, and many others. The first group of projects funded under FP7 ran up to 2012. And here you will certainly recognize Presto Prime, which was the largest one, and many of you will remember Shaman, because some of this work is also being continued in Aparthen and other projects. Aparthen itself is part of another group of projects that has run up until this year, or will finish this year. And as you can see, I put a person as the biggest logo in the middle, which is obviously a tribute to the event today. But it's also because a person is a network of excellence, and as such, it is in its nature that it doesn't only carry out research within the project itself, but also consolidates the work going on elsewhere. As I said, these projects have finished or will finish this year, and therefore it's perhaps a good point in time to ask which results have been achieved. And there are many, as there are many projects and many successful projects. So I've been struggling to present that in a way that it would not take me the whole day. So please bear with me if you think the one or the other is missing in the following. We're talking about research. So very important results are, of course, new technologies or technology advancements. And here are a few examples, like models for the characterization of digital objects, methods and tools to support preservation workflows, planning, quality control, ingest, etc. Increased automation and scalability, important to lower costs and to deal with large-scale data. Some projects have advanced the technologies for web archiving, and one project has created an emulation framework that was showcased on early computer games. Generally, as the memory institutions, the end users, are participating directly in the projects, this has led to a high degree of take-up of results in the partner institutions, and in some cases also beyond. So that is also good news. Another type of results are services. Here, the first one is the OPF, now called Open Preservation Foundation. And you will remember that is a community that has emerged around the open source tools created in the Planets project, so one of the first projects that was funded. And 2012, the Presto Center was opened. That is a competence center for the preservation of digital audiovisual material. And from now on, we will also have the Virtual Center of Excellence of Aparsen, about which I will not talk here because there are people here who do that much better than me. At a higher level, we can also observe that this massive investment in research has strengthened the cooperation between the stakeholders, that it has created a solid body of expertise in the EU research community, and that is also internationally recognized. We can see that in the contributions at events, in awards for papers or technologies, in the contributions to standards, and also in the leadership in certain areas, such as the preservation of the audiovisual resources of the web, trusted repositories, scalability, and maybe some other. We noticed over time that there were more industrial participants in the projects. That is also positive because it helps the technologies emerging from the research being further developed and eventually being taken up by the market. So it helps the sustainability of the research work. And then there is a wealth of training material that has emerged from the large-scale projects mainly, not least from Aparsen. And those projects have produced training courses or modules of training courses. They have organized summer schools, workshops, seminars, everything you can imagine. And in many cases, they have made this material also available online to share it with a broader audience. Some researchers have come across the questions or were confronted with the questions how to deal with legal issues. And that is a knowledge that we've also been trying to feed back into the ongoing copyright discussions. Now, that I'm talking about results does not mean that digital preservation is already a closed book today in the European Commission. As you can see here, there are actually many projects that have started only recently and will run for the next 3 to 4 years. Here, at least two will be familiar to you, Prelida and Pericles, which will be presented tomorrow. And I'm happy to see that because it shows that a person continues the dialogue with other research groups. Those projects, with one exception, result from one work program where we wanted to stimulate work in 3 areas. The first one was techniques and tools to recover loss and to repair digital objects that are damaged, including also to understand how damage and loss happen in order to protect newly created resources. This is addressed, amongst others, by the project David, focusing on audiovisual digital files, which is showing already impressive results. The second area of work was to embed reasoning and intelligence in the information workflow. And that had 2 aspects. One is the reasoning behind the selection, what should be preserved and why, including also identifying obsolete information. And the other is to keep information or keep digital resources not only physically available, but also understandable and meaningful, despite evolving use contexts and interpretations. So to capture this semantic decay is the challenge here. This challenge has been picked up by 2 large-scale projects, Forget It and Pericles, which I mentioned already. And I will be curious how these 2 projects evolve. And finally, we fund coordination actions to promote the uptake of research outcomes and to reach out to new stakeholders. And there I would like to mention Prelida and 4C, looking at cost models. The impact that we wanted to achieve, or that we still want to achieve, obviously, not only with this last work program, but generally with the digital preservation research, are obviously to reduce information loss, also to reduce the costs for digital preservation, and to improve the capacity and the competencies of the organizations responsible for it. Then we also want to strengthen the position of the European technology providers and their competitiveness, including the small ones. And we wanted to have an impact on the European research landscape, to reshape this research landscape. And that leads me nicely to a new milestone in this research landscape, the Aparson Center of Excellence. Now, I hope very much that this will be a success, that you can continue to keep the community together and to make it grow, that you will launch new initiatives and new projects, I believe you have an important role to play as the world is more and more digital, and the legacy of digital information to be preserved for future generations is ever growing. I also believe that you are ambitious and that you are determined to fulfill this role. So I present you my best wishes. I'm crossing my fingers for the Center of Excellence. And I count on you that you don't forget to invite me when you celebrate your 10th anniversary. Thank you.
Manuela, for that overview of the EC perspective that has been leading up to the APARZEN Centre of Excellence. Of course, as you made it very clear, APARZEN doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are many other projects and initiatives and indeed infrastructures which have points of contact and overlap, and we're now going to hear about the European Grid Initiative from Michael Drescher, the technical manager of EGI. So let me find your slides. That must be the one. Yeah, there you are. Yes.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. My first correction is it's not an initiative anymore, it's an infrastructure. It's the initiative started about good 4 years ago with an idea to actually put an infrastructure that has been majority used for high-energy physicists at CERN and worldwide for the research into production and open it up to many, many different research communities and infrastructures in Europe. So I plan to talk about 3 topics. The first one is how we see data, information, and the value in that, and what do we do with that? How do we grasp, as infrastructure providers, the value in data? That's something that's relatively new for us. We treated data as something that our researchers used, but we didn't really used to look much further than that. But throughout the talk, it's probably clearer than what we meant with it and how that came to be. Oops. The second one is the largest part, telling you about the European grid infrastructure, who we are, what we do, what our services are, which then accumulates in the last part, from research into production, where I'm going to make a point in joining forces of EGI and the APARZEN project, and for what and why we do that. So the first one, value in data information, and what parts of that are the real value and how we, which pieces do we need to extract to sustain. Everybody's talking about big data, right? But nobody really knows what it is. It's an amorphous term. It's the problem is that a lot of people say a lot of right things about it, and a sort of a good description is that it has the 4 V's and a C. It means volume, the heap of data, which you simply cannot cope with it. It's about the variety, which means from which discipline comes it. There's a huge variety of people who actually create a lot of data, and I have some slides on that. Then the third one is velocity, actually the speed of intake of data. If you look at large research projects like the Square Kilometer Array radio astronomy initiative, or recent bioinformatics gene sequencing machines, they are exploding with the capability of generating data, which is really unprecedented in Europe and worldwide. Then variability means actually looking into the data and inconsistencies, looking at that. You can't, it's not really curated data. It has holes, it has, hiccups in there, and which just gets your research algorithms choking up and crashing your machines. So this is something that you have to look at. And the last thing is the complexity. You have connected data, you have multiple sources. You don't have, in the classic world, you seem to have always a very defined high-quality source of data. Nowadays, you have data coming from all kinds of areas. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not there. It's, how do you connect that? How is the data permanently available and things like that? So the complexity actually looking at big data is a very, very big issue here, and which requires new ways of using it. Data links and patterns resonates a bit with the complexity and the inherent problems of data. This is actually an image from Wikipedia itself, looking at the amount of text and pictures and the links with it within the wikipedia.org website, and the knowledge that's preserved, or rather information that's preserved in that. Another one, very important that we talked about, that our EC project officer has looked at. This actually is a digitization of the Heracles papyrus from the 3rd century. Cultural heritage. It's not only scanning that parchment is very important, but also looking at it. What does this little drawing on the right side mean? What does the text mean? Can we complement that and things like that? The decay of the parchment resonates with the decay of electronic data, and the memory institutes are very, very concerned about that, and they are talking about hundreds of years of preservation, something that parchments can do. Digital infrastructures seem to be much more transient in resonance with that. Industrial manufacturing, and I'm very happy that I have Hans-Ulrich Heidbrink here, is something that people often forget. It's that when you do an industrial design of, in this case, some cylinders for an engine, but a very good example is that a very simple piece, it's for airplanes, the frame where you put the window in the tube of the airplane. This thing is a very key component of an airplane. If that is malfunctioning, then you have a problem, right? So you need to store and preserve the original designs of your window frame or window unit used in assembly of an airplane for decades of years, 10, 20, 30, 50, even 70 years. You know, the times that airplanes are in practical use is 50 years and longer. And for that time and beyond, you need to preserve your original designs for legal obligations. So the people forget about that. These guys really have a problem as well. And is it their purpose to preserve, or is their purpose to design? So that's a big problem. Should they accumulate ICT skills to preserve all that, or should they rather outsource that to someone who actually knows digital preservation? And then 3 very scientific examples. The CMS detector at CERN. I'm very happy that we have a representative from CERN here who can tell you a lot about that. And these guys really have a problem to store all the data that comes from the Large Hadron Collider. You know, that's these guys who have discovered the Higgs boson, which gives gravity to everything. So they have the research data, and at some point in the future, the LHC will be shut down to be upgraded, and then the data needs to be stored somewhere for research, for people that want to use the data. The problem is that scientists are rightfully afraid that the data that they at some point have taken, A, cannot be taken anymore because you don't know the configuration of your measurements, of your instruments anymore, and B, that the data, the original data, shouldn't be lost because what you can process today, or the algorithms and the techniques that you use today, might overlook certain results in the data that you might be able to discover 10, 20, 30 years ago. Right. The next one is geo research, Earth science usually. It's a picture from NASA looking at Earth at night as a representation of what the ESA is doing long term, looking at how deforestation, for example, goes. So you have to take pictures of the same area for over 10 years to actually visualize how deforestation, for example, in the Amazon area is working. And all these kind of scientific communities are working with EGI. And the lower right is a gene sequencing machine from Illumina, a US company that actually does mass gene replication for research and simulation. And these guys, these machines are producing data that's unbelievable. You can't really take that in with common ICT infrastructure. So we have a wide variety of things that we need to preserve. And we have a big problem that we have today. Data is generated, it is used. What happens then? It's forgotten, it's lost. So we get occult knowledge that people, researchers, become the gatekeeper to data, and nobody really knows where it is, what it is. In EGR, we had we store hundreds of petabytes of data, mostly from the high-energy physicists, but estimations were that about a third to a half of the data is actually dark data that nobody really knows anymore what it is, when it has been taken, or in which instrument configuration has been taken. What is it? Nobody knows. So we have a real problem there. So I was at a conference in London at TPDL this year, and I met an old fellow that I used to work with in the grid days. And he's working with students, and he says, I quote him, "If only I can make our students to properly manage their Excel sheets." And this is the problem of preservation in science today. So yeah, I lent him my ear and he was just ranting about the students, so then he felt better after that. But we really have that problem. So when we look at preserving data, what are we actually looking for? And this comes from the area of intellectual knowledge working as a knowledge manager, knowledge person, is that there are basically two continuums. One is data, the raw data that's taken from instruments or a temperature measurement somewhere in the city. This is raw data that needs to be stored, but giving that data context leads to something that we call information. And that's very important because raw data doesn't bring anything. You need the context to actually make sense of the data. If you have 20 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius in Amsterdam, is that hot or is that cold? Or how does that compare to your normal temperature range over the year in Amsterdam? That gives information. The problem is that the next two continuums are knowledge and wisdom. And these two are generally considered as internalized in a person. A person in their brain internalizes information with further context and generates knowledge out of that. And the important part here is that that's why they're colored in different colors, that data and information are external, can be stored and preserved. And they're generally looking at the past. Data has been taken, information has been preserved or has been written. But knowledge and wisdom are forward-looking because I use that in my brain, in my intellectual capacity to look forward, to make decisions on how and when to use which data and information. And this is starting to generate the cycle of generally elevating people's knowledge and wisdom. But this is a very painful process to come to the same level of knowledge between two people because they basically have to generate the same mind map within people that they have to internalize. And that's a very painful process. So do not ever try to preserve knowledge. It doesn't work. We tried, and it didn't work. So something is not working here. Okay, there it was. If you look at that, the EGI is like every e-infrastructure provider itself under cost pressures. Everything has to go cheaper. So if you look at the preservation, when do we best preserve data? And this and the next slide are actually from William Kilbride from the Digital Preservation Coalition in England. He has a lovely Scottish accent, very melodic. I love to listen to him. He's a very good presenter, a very good guy. So if you look at digital objects, they have a life cycle. You start with them, and at some point they become obsolete, or maybe not, depending on what you want. So the classic, fairly simple observation is that the later you start to actually think about preservation, and the later you start with actually doing it, becomes much more expensive. Yeah? Same with project preparation or proposal preparation. The later you do something in the preparation stage, the more costly it is because you have to change a lot of things in the proposal to make it consistent and everything else. If you think about it beforehand, you know what you need to do. But this is not really the first position or the first phase where you have to look at. You also have projects in which you actually generate the data or project proposals, things like that. So over the life cycle of the project, it also becomes more expensive. And the actual cost of preservation is the product of those two aspects of a digital object within itself and within the project. Luckily, we do have something that sort of pushes again the cost of preservation, and that's technological infrastructure innovation that makes things cheaper, but only to a certain extent. So there is a very important intellectual question that we have to ask is, can we arrive at a state where we have sort of ready-made preservation objects? We just get them into existence, and then all the problems that we have right now with preservation go away. If you plan preservation, if you decide to do that, then there are actually also a slide from William Kilbride that's very, very important. This one, I think this is one of the key slides ever. We have to look at 18 questions. You have to answer them before you actually start doing things, or this is what you have to cover your bases. Who, what, where, when, and how. Almost sounds like, what a good journalist does in his article in the newspapers. The same principles. So, and these are his questions. I totally subscribe them. Who are the users of the data, short-term and long-term? Identify them and know their problems and their needs, and you know a lot about the preservation. Who actually maintains intellectual property? Very important. It resonates very much with your presentation about intellectual property. We were part of the DCHRP project and also part of the Preformer project with small contributions. And some of our experiments simply didn't go through, they failed because of intellectual property rights, where we wanted to use digital objects, images from the Swedish Rix Archivet to use in our experiments, and the Memory Institute said no. It's not allowed to leave our premises. There we go. So who maintains actually the integrity? If I maintain a simple scan of an old ancient book, who actually is the guardian of the integrity of that scan, that it still shows you that, and the page number 53 of a book? You need to identify those people. What actually is the content? What are you trying to preserve? Is it technical CAD documents? Is it scans in TIFF format of an old book, or things like that? What are the formats? Do you use TIFF formats? Do you use PDF, PDFA, things like that? All these questions need to be answered in order for those who provide you with the infrastructure to actually give you a proper response. And of course, what's the size, right? The big data volume, the volume question. How much data do you preserve? Is it terabytes? Is it petabytes? Things like that. And providers need to make provisions for that. You can't just go to an infrastructure provider and say, listen, I'm a memory institute and I have 500 petabytes of data that I want to have preserved tomorrow. It's impossible. But if you go to them and say, I have 5 gigabytes of data, that's very precious to me, can I get your storage service? Yes, sure, no problem. So you need to know the size of your digital collection that you need to preserve. Where? It's a very important question, particularly in Europe and in the single digital market in Europe. Where is the master of data? Is it allowed to make copies within the Memory Institute, within the country, cross-border within Europe, or even outside of Europe? What's with affiliated countries? What's with Switzerland, for example, Norway? Other countries that are not part of the legal framework of the European Union, but are part of the European Economic Area? Things like that. Are you allowed to export the data internationally? All these questions have to be answered. They're very important. Next one, when? It's very important to answer those questions as well. How long do you actually think your data should be available? It's very important you preserve data, but it can be available or not available when you go into long-term dark archives. It's a very important question that needs to be answered for the right infrastructure to be delivered for your problem. What happens in terms of catastrophes? What's your contingency plan? What's your disaster recovery plan for that? What happens when your single original data item gets lost? Hopefully it doesn't, but you need to prepare for that. Standard ICT best practices tell you that you must have a contingency plan. You must have a disaster recovery plan. Somehow these kind of things are missing in preservation, or at least these questions haven't been asked in the preservation problem space. And of course, in the end, how are the technicalities of how do we create the repository? How will it be maintained? Who is going to do that? How will it be updated? Will there be updates? Things like that. All these questions very much need to be answered. And I know I'm horribly over time, but I'll try to speed up a bit. So, what is the European Grid Infrastructure, and why do we bother with that? So, our mission, we want to be part of the European research area's backbone as a key provider for e-infrastructure for the European, for the ERR. Our mission is to provide open access to transnational compute, storage, data, and knowledge, as well as expertise. We have a couple of showcases. Go to that URL and you find a wealth of information about that, what we do, how we do it, and why we do it. How do we provision our services? First of all, it's uniform. We provide uniform access wherever the resources are and how heterogeneous they are. We are making heavy use of standards. We provide distributed storage services, much like EUDAT, but more in a context rather than being generic. We provide grid and cloud services, mostly based on the various different use cases our research communities have. And actually, EGI is not one single entity, it's a federation. So the federation, a bit more about that. We have members of publicly funded infrastructures. We have CERN is, for example, part of our infrastructure, and our federation, EMBL as well, and Heidelberg, and others. We have institutional infrastructures that are integrated and federated through our technical teams. And we have one and the other commercial provider that already started and decided to join the federation and provide the services as part of that. And the general approach to that is simply because we are in a non-profit-oriented area and arena. Most of the resources are free at the point of use. So somebody else, in quotes, has to come up with cost recovery for that, and that's usually through national infrastructures, national strategies, and yes, also EU projects. We are having or setting up a pay-per-use initiative, mostly with our commercial providers, but also some institutes are allowed by national policy to make some profits. for as long as it doesn't exceed a certain threshold, to actually help with our sustainability of our federation and the members of our federation, because if they are not sustainable, we are neither. So there's a problem, so we help them with that to actually try and set up the business process for them and for us to actually get this done. This is how EGI looks today in its geographic dispersion. There are lots of numbers on there, I won't say much. The biggest thing that you need to take away from that is that we have these massive blobs of yellow points in Europe, but we also have lots of connections and technical integration with basically all key worldwide infrastructures, the US, Open Science Grid, Exceed, with the Canadians, with the Brazilians and the Chileans through EU-Brazil Cloud Connect. We have a strong collaboration with those. With New Zealand, with Australia, we have long-standing history of connections with the Japanese, Taiwanese and China as well. So we are basically having points of presences, if you like, even though they are outside of our own legal framework worldwide. We have undergone in the recent years a strong restructuring of our services and our service portfolio. You see basically 3 different areas where we provide our services and solutions. The historic one, or the legacy coming from the EGEE and the LHC commitment, is the high throughput data analysis that was back then basically predominantly for CERN and the WLCG consortium. The federated cloud is something that came the last couple of years as an initiative to provide an alternative way to share the resources. Also, the third one that completes the picture is the community-driven innovations and support, and a bit more on 2 of those in those slides. The federated cloud. Basically what you need to take away from that is that a lot of institutes around Europe have already deployed and toyed around with cloud infrastructure. In this sense, it means using virtualization and cloud management frameworks like OpenNebula and OpenStack and others and things like that. So most people associate cloud computing with virtualization and virtual machines and things like that, but it's actually more than that, and we are trying to go into that direction with that as well. So the takeaway points here is it's a federation of resource exposure and sharing. It's using, yes, virtual machines predominantly, but we also provide cloud storage and other features. And how we enact that federation is basically by inheriting the back office resources and services that we already have put in production since 10s and 15s of years that came from the high throughput grid infrastructure that we have, such as federated AI, accounting, grid and service monitoring and things like that. This is how the federated cloud looks today. It's much smaller than what we have in our grid world, simply because it's so new. But the important point is the coverage of European countries. It's an initiative that started about 2 to 3 years ago, with a bit of a slow start, but it's really picking up. It's in production since May 2014. That means that any research community can actually come to us and use it. And since then, we have about, on average, 1 community coming to us asking for cloud resources. And then we had to very quickly ramp up our intake procedures for those research communities, because otherwise it would have been too much. But we also have constant growth in actual capacity and federation members, and it's going worldwide. And I'm happy to say that last week the Texas University in the United States has committed to integrating large parts of their infrastructure through an OpenStack deployment into the federated cloud. The Koreans are already they're in the last stages of getting certified as a member of the federated cloud infrastructure. Australia is very much interested, New Zealand is interested, and it's growing. It's, we don't even have to say anymore or actively go into, saying come into the federation. People come to ourselves. It seems to, we seem to have hit the threshold where it starts, where mouth-to-mouth propaganda takes the work off our shoulders to say who we are and what we are doing. The second one is potentially for this conference, the more important one, the community-driven innovation and support. And there's one key sentence there, and that's the European Distributed Competence Centers. And this should already ring a couple of bells if you have listened to the first presentations already. I will skip through the details of that slide. You'll find that slide deck in your materials, no doubt. Now the thing is, once we have a bit of a look at what's data, what's big data, what can we retain from that, and what is EGI, now we're going to bring both together. And it started in, I think, 2013 in Malta when I was at the TPDL 2013 conference, and I met Ruben and Matthias Hemje from FDK in Germany, and that really started the ball rolling. I was there as part of the DCHRP project, which is now closing, and we started to look at what APA, Aparson, and the Shaman project did, what we are doing, and then we immediately had the spark, hey, there's got to be something that we need to do, because basically what we realized is that we have a huge potential for synergy. We have a huge infrastructure, but we don't know anything about preservation, but we knew it was important. We just didn't figure out yet how, what, and when, what the details are. On the other hand, there's the Aparson project that knows everything about preservation, but was looking for a large infrastructure to actually roll it out and scale it out. So there we were. That's how it started. So our basic goal is that we go from research data and occult knowledge, we go to create, use, and reuse, and go into much more organized fashion. This is actually a picture of a library in Mexico City, and that was just so compelling, the way it was organized, and almost like industrial, containerized way of storing and organizing your data. That was to me very impressive. Going from this fussy, dusty library to this very organized, almost machine-like automated library. And every second I try and I expect to see a robot going through and picking the book that you want. Things like this is where we want to go, right? And now the question is, how do we fix that? How do we get there? So the first thing we did is actually sign an MOU between EGI and Aparson, and it's in force since, I think, beginning of this year, or was it? Yes. Since then, we actually have had a lot of meetings together with a good bunch of guys from Aparson, a good bunch of guys and girls from EGI, and with lots of fun, and started to figure out what we want to do together. So to actually, a very important part for us, for everybody actually, is to make the whole thing sustainable. And how do we do that? We have to look at the actual, promoting the value of the data itself, of data and information. How do you do that? At the moment, still, it is fairly a niche, but it needs to go into mainstream to actually get people to see the value of data. A lot more people need to know that, and we need to give the preservation of the problem a much more visibility, and the response, the services to actually make it done. So what we did is we identified a couple of those stakeholders in that area, where we have EGI as an infrastructure provider and Aparson as the digital preservation specialist, to work together and target some of those stakeholders in a longer ongoing activity, which I'm talking about right now. So, inspired by the discussions and by the roadmap given from the DCHRP project, where we discuss this concept further, we look at preservation as a service. Why not tell the member institutes, the researchers, you guys don't need to be specialists in preservation. We do that for you. You do your research, we take care of the other problems. We take care of that the data will stay. We give you services to easily annotate data, to give metadata, to get the provenance and the data retention, all these problems that are attached to preservation. We take care of that and give you easy means to actually accomplish that without losing too much time or becoming an ICT expert. This is one of the, if I'm allowed to make that cross connection from the DCHRP roadmap, that makes a very specific recommendation, particularly for the cultural heritage, but also for other areas of research. These guys are no ICT experts. We've done experiments in the DCHRP project, and what's very common in infrastructure projects is that software is written, but the level of expertise expected, intrinsically expected, without actually expressing that when the software is released as an item, as a good success of the project is, hey, you need to know what apt-get install is, you need to know how Linux works, you need to know this and this and this. No, we are talking about people who are experts in deciphering old books, preserving old books. These guys know how to use a laptop and know how to double-click an icon, if I may be so blunt to say that. But that's okay, that's their role, that's what they're supposed to do. They're not supposed to install software. They're not supposed to know how to fix bugs. This is our job, and this is part of our service. And therefore, we came up with the concept of preservation as a service that we provide together. So the first and pretty much initial idea was to actually make use of the EGI Federated Cloud as a strategic decision to virtualize certain services and to make use of the easy scale-out capability of the Federated Cloud infrastructure to reach as many research communities as possible, both in terms of communities but also geographic dispersion. On top of that, we envisioned actually a real platform which is comprised of a couple of services. One part of them is what we call shared services that are really the ones that we expect every community to use. Persistent identifier services, virtual machine repositories that you need to actually encapsulate services to be deployed and distributed on the EGI federated cloud infrastructure. And that can potentially go from, say, Portugal to Greece or Bulgaria. It can go from Finland down to Italy even. It doesn't matter where it is, for as long as we make certain configuration connections, the virtual machines are automatically distributed and available for instantiation and execution wherever you want them. So these services are in a very technical way multi-tenant capable. They are services that provide capabilities that we expect for every community to be the same, or reasonably the same, so that we can use it as is. The second part is basically looking at services that are not quite there yet, that are not either not generic enough to be deployed as is, or are meant to be generic, that need to be configured or integrated for a certain community, right? If you take an example, a database, a MySQL database is a very generic piece of information, of software, but you actually need to deploy your own schema, your database schema on top of it to make sense for a certain problem that you want to solve with that. So that kind of software is then in the second category that we use to emulate multi-tenancy, a very typical pattern that commercial cloud providers use as well when they provide services to many of their customers. Or software that needs to be configured in a certain way or customized. And this is part of the value proposition that we are doing, is saying we are so efficient in doing that that you would on your own never be able to do that either efficiently in the same time and with much more money than we would be able to do that. And this is, you know, the balance, the value for money that you get with coming to us to do that. And the third one is actually the typical batch job-like traditional services that you need for regular compliance checks or for transforming data from one probably obsolete or a depreciated file format into another one. So these kind of things are typically batch-oriented jobs that we can use through certain gateways in the existing EGI infrastructure. It works already. We just need to find the correct input parameters from the where, who, how, what, and where from the 18 questions that need to be asked beforehand to actually make those services on the spot directed at your problem. And on top of that, of course, we envision certain community-specific services that are already long-standing in their vision, long-standing running, and they know exactly how to use that. And with you know, they have already built up the expertise for that, and that software is too specific for a community to be able to efficiently put that into the digital preservation platform to make use of that for other communities. So with that, and this is my last slide, I hope I didn't go too much. We are looking at those various different capabilities and our joint collaboration. Those are packaged in 3 different core activities or aspects of our service to research communities and others. ICT service is clearly from EGI. Consultancy is we see Aparsin as our key partner in that. You guys know everything about preservation while we don't. You guys can actually tell the communities what they should do, how to use the platform, and in the end, actually, we both train. We train the communities in how to use the services, we train the trainers, we train the members of the virtual centers of excellence of Aparsin on how to use it, how to sell it. These guys are actually the ones who in the commercial world would be called solution providers to the or solution architects to the communities to which we are going to sell the services. And with that, I'm at the end, and hopefully I'm quite good in time. Thank you very much. Any questions? If there are no questions, then I'll hand over to Simon. I'm around for today and the first part of tomorrow, so if you have any more questions, then grab me by my badge and take me wherever you want to take me to ask. Thanks a lot.
Great. Okay, so the next talk will be about a particular national perspective, because of course the APARZEN Centre of Excellence has got to take into account national particularities when offering its services. So we're going to hear from Silvio Salza of the University of Rome La Sapienza about the particular case of Italy. So there we are.
Yeah. Good morning. I will briefly discuss our experience in trying to understand how to deploy the services of a Center of Excellence in Italy, so in a specific country. The first question is, does it make sense to specialize at national level? And according to our experience, the answer is yes. Because according to our experiences, it may be necessary in shaping the offer to take into account some national peculiarities. The first issue is national regulations. You may have in different countries different regulations, specific national regulation about digital preservation. For instance, which is especially true in Italy, as I will discuss in a moment. The second issue is following from specificity of national regulation, you may have market peculiarity, and you have to understand it and to identify your target customers. Third issue is language. According to our experience, at least in Italy, there is a clear demand for training in Italian in the national language, beside training, of course, in English. Now, the situation of a regulation for digital preservation in Italy. We have national regulation, quite extensive kind of regulation since quite a long time, let's say 20 years. And this is because there was this early strong drive toward using digital records. This was because we had at very early times full legal validity of a digital signature. That means that we have a lot of records which are digitally signed. We have not for this record paper original, and so there is a problem. There was an early problem for digital preservation. Early regulation that we had were merely concerned about the integrity of and the authenticity of data. They discussed mostly digital signature, digital timestamps, and so on. But fortunately, we have more recent regulation that are more quality-minded. So they specify standard file formats that should be used. They go into the reliability of the procedures, and they define a standard metadata set which should be used. An important thing is in Italy is the digital registry system that is in several countries in Europe. Historically, we have it in Italy since a very long time. That means that in any public administration, all incoming and outgoing mail must be registered. And when it's registered, it enters the archive. Now, what happened is that since, let's say, more than 15 years, we have a digital registry system which is mandatory for all public administration. That means that the archive of this administration had to become digital, since the registry and the copies of the attached files are preserved as digital objects. So it's a very large market, at least in the public administration. And the registry system is interesting also because it provides crucial information for the preservation. For instance, when you register, you get information about provenance, context, reference, and fixity, so that the typical information, which is called PDI in the OAIS model, and you get it from the registration. All these regulations are together in a large corpus which is called the Code of Digital Administration. It contains everything about digital signature, digital registry system, and the preservation. And regulation applies to public administration, which is a large market, and also to private parties as far as specific records with legal value are concerned. And this code includes details rule about preservation, which hopefully are in line with OAIS and ISO 16363. So they are up to date. Recent developments. There was a strong push, there is now a strong push in Italy in extending eGov services. This is due to well-known budget cuts that we have to do because, I mean, Europe is pushing in this direction. It's a good thing after all. And this means generalizing digital interaction between citizen, companies, and the public administration. Very recently, there was a bill that says that all administrative procedures in Italy must become digital in a very short time, digital and web-based. That means more digital objects to preserve, and that means also something new. When you automatize an administrative procedure, typically you move from documents, the traditional way to handle it, to data. So you won't keep documents, you just update databases with a very basic information. That is some kind of shift in digital object and in preservation, because the new challenge now is to preserve database, that means dynamic objects, and so you must change something, because most of our approach is typically devoted to preserve statical digital objects. The involved parties are, of course, the public administration, because all public administration must comply, but also private companies, since in Italy, since many years, all budget and all legal and fiscal documentation are kept only in digital form. There are no paper original. And now there is also a strong drive toward e-invoicing. For instance, all companies, when they bill the public administration, cannot do it on paper. They must use e-invoicing. So even more stuff that needs to be preserved. Very interesting partners are, of course, memory, scientific, and cultural institutions. Why? because, as we will see in a moment, the public administration and the private companies are mostly interested in complying with regulation. Instead, typically, memory, scientific and cultural institutions, they are more sensitive to the quality of the process. And so, I mean, they are a more interested partner and more interested target for the Center of Excellence services. In principle, in Italy, everyone can manage his own preservation, digital preservation, but very few actually would do it because, I mean, they don't like to take direct responsibility. And so most would rely on third-party services. Actually, the law in Italy envisage certified providers which provide preservation as a service. And they take part of legal responsibility. And of course, there is a certification process which is stated by the law, but the story is that in Italy, certification is granted by a national agency. So there is not too much room for certification because it's already done and in exclusive way by a national agency, which is called DigitPA. And the same agency issues regulations which fortunately are based on ISO 16363. Now, if the situation is this, is there really any room for action? Actually, as I already said, many involved parties, they want just to comply with regulation. So they won't be looking for any assistance, and they would revert directly to certified providers. But hopefully there are some parties, memory and scientific institutions, that want something more. Something more is understanding the preservation process and even more, maintaining direct control over quality and managing not only the preservation phase, but as a whole, the whole life cycle of digital objects. And these are our main targets. So let's see very briefly what we are doing and what we plan to do. Now, first part of our offer is training. As I said, we offer both, the standard training that is offered by Appersen Center of Excellence and training in Italian. Since unfortunately in Italy, beside the scientific milieu, several people are not familiar with English and they pretend training in Italian. It's not nice, but it's a fact. And we offer consulting in setting up and managing the preservation process that you need even if you rely on a certified provider, which makes something in your preservation, but not everything. You still need to organize it, and it's not trivial. And of course, there is some room for audit and certification. Not really about this certification which is done by the national agency, but we may assist organization in this, and moreover, there are organizations which are interested in assessing the reliability of their preservation system and the quality of their procedures. Current actions. First thing, we are working on setting up a qualified user group, a community, and in this part, we work in close cooperation with some crucial partners like National Archives, Library, some central administration, mainly the Ministry of Cultural Heritage, the university, which are interested. Why? Because the university need to manage their institutional repository. Institutional repository are papers and now data sets, PhD thesis, and so on. So it's a responsibility, and they are interested in doing it properly. And of course, there are also other quality-minded organizations. Training, we already held several courses, both formal qualification with credits and introductory courses. And we will say more tomorrow in the session about training. And we have prepared online training materials, both directly from these courses and also translation of Apperson training pills and other material we are working on. The typical format is streamed slideshow with voice comment. It's not exactly e-learning. We are also thinking about e-learning courses for standard platforms, but this needs a lot of effort, and so we are looking for some kind of additional funding, unless we cannot do it properly. Third action is consulting, and consulting I already discussed with the kind of consulting we provide and the kind of target. It's mostly about planning and about assessing the quality of preservation processes. And all these stuff, we will make it available through an Italian portal, and which is specific to our services, and it will become hopefully the main reference point for the community in Italy and the access to our services. Now, conclusions. As we have seen, it makes sense in some countries, at least, to have national outlets of a center of excellence. This because of national peculiarities, mostly regulations and language. And we are working in understanding and attracting local communities, and we are setting up what we call a national center of excellence, which also will act as a hub to the main center of excellence. So we provide directly some specific services, and we will turn for general service to the Apperson main center of excellence. And last remark is our preliminary experience has provided overall a quite positive feedback. So that was all. Thank you for your attention and your patience. Thank you. Okay.
You mentioned this
Okay, so thank you, Silvio. So now we have a coffee break for half an hour. So let's resume at quarter past 11. So coffee is available outside, I believe. Thank you.